Hi, this is Dan Joseph with the China Learning Curve. Welcome to our video newsletter for April 2015. As always, we'll do a quick review of three main news categories: 1, economic performance; 2, liberalization; and 3, law and politics, with a particular emphasis on the rule of law. And we'll also touch on any other important news during the month. Let's start with economic performance. The theme for the year continued: slower growth, an economy in transition but not collapsing, and a government response that has been so far fairly restrained and prudent. Growth for the first quarter was 7%, the slowest in 6 years. Most data, including exports, imports, industrial production, inflation, and factory activity, all point toward a relatively weak economy that might not even meet the lower expectations that have been set by the government. As part of the new environment, capital outflows continued, but not at an alarming rate, a reaction to a slowing economy, not a panic on the part of investors. The government hasn't panicked either. Debt levels and money supply growth are not accelerating significantly, demonstrating that recent stimulatory measures haven't had a huge impact. In April, another cut to banks' reserve requirements, this one a full percentage point, was made, but the impact of that, like previous stimulatory measures, could be muted for a variety of reasons, including that more money in the economy could add to capital outflows and end up in unproductive sectors like real estate or stock market speculation, as opposed to actually promoting economic activity. Will the government continue to take a prudent approach and resist the temptation to use spending and/or monetary policy to supercharge the economy? Although there is a faction within the government that favors greater short-term stimulus, in April, the central bank's chief economist said that significant stimulus is not necessary. So odds are that the government will continue to take a prudent approach to guiding the economy to its new normal. Our roundup of company-related news echoes the trend of China's broader economic transition. Consumer-oriented companies, for example Apple and Mercedes-Benz, continue to do well in China, while industrial firms like Caterpillar and Cummins Engine report that they are struggling with slower demand. Another indicator comes in the form of venture capital. A record amount of venture capital was deployed in China in the first quarter, with the total amount deployed during that period equal to 40% of what was deployed all last year, which was a record in and of itself. Plus, about two-thirds of that capital was devoted to consumer services. The point is that company and industry performance seems to support the notion that China's economy isn't collapsing, but rather transitioning to a more rational model, with less reliance on exports and industrial activity and infrastructure, and more reliance on consumers and technology. For a roundup of news relative to economic liberalization, we had some interesting small steps in April, but nothing earth-shattering. China's new investment catalog, which lays out which industries are open to foreign investment, took effect in April, although it had been approved several months earlier. The new catalog has some positive movement relative to sectors like medical services, telecommunications, e-commerce, and financial services, but stopped short of being a dramatic opening of China's direct investment rules. Such a dramatic opening could be realized later in the year, as China has announced it is working on a new foreign investment law, which some think could provide more sweeping reforms. We'll have to wait and see. China also opened 3 new free trade zones in Guangdong, Fujian, and Tianjin, all of which had been announced and approved months ago. Lastly, and perhaps most interestingly, April saw 2 Chinese companies, including a state-owned enterprise, default on publicly held bonds. There was another company that defaulted just last month. The defaults are important because in China's capital markets, the market has always assumed the government would stand behind any Chinese borrower. Allowing defaults is the first step toward removing the implied government guarantee, which is an important step toward a free capital market. And of course, capital market liberalization is high on the list of priorities for China's economic reform program. It will be interesting to see how things proceed with these defaults and how many more might be on the horizon. In the area of law and politics, a couple of interesting items. A leading official said that penalties for intellectual property violations will likely be increased. The second such statement by the government in recent months, and hopefully an indication that China will be moving forward with better IP protection. In a related note, telecommunications equipment company ZTE announced plans to take legal action against fellow Chinese telecom equipment company Huawei relative to alleged patent infringement. This is another example of why China needs to improve relative to the rule of law, and a reason why China is likely to do so. Chinese companies are creating more and more of their own intellectual property and are finding themselves in disputes with each other relative to that intellectual property. The more Chinese companies go up against each other, the more likely they will want a fair settlement to their disputes, as opposed to a resolution based on politics or graft or whatever it might have been in the past. There's also an interesting story relative to how the New York Times is getting around China's censorship. Now you can see the written newsletter for a description of the technical means by which the Times is circumventing restrictions in China. But 2 points are worth making here. First, a senior manager for the Times publicly states that the Chinese government knows what the Times is doing to skirt its own internet restrictions. Now the implication, of course, is that the government knows and doesn't really care. Secondly, that same official insists that the Chinese government has assured the Times that recent tightening of internet restrictions will be temporary, and they are not meant to be a new normal for China. Now, if you've read our newsletter in the past, you know that we have speculated that perhaps China's recent political clampdown, particularly relative to the internet, won't be a long-term phenomenon, both because it can't be sustained technically and because the Chinese government's motivation might be more short-term in nature, trying to keep a lid on things during the economic slowdown and amidst the most intense part of the corruption crackdown. This story on the Times would seem to lend some credence to that point of view. Time will tell. Lastly, we have a brief story about the debut of China's Great Cannon, companion to the Great Firewall, and considered to be China's next major weapon in the ongoing cyber espionage battle. The Great Cannon is a system that allows China to intercept foreign web traffic as it flows to Chinese website, inject malicious code, and then repurpose the traffic as Beijing sees fit, such as by trying to overwhelm another website with too much traffic. The report also said that the Great Cannon could be used to spy on anyone who happens to fetch content hosted on a Chinese computer. Apparently, the Great Cannon is quite similar to a system developed by the United States' own NSA, as revealed by the Edward Snowden leaks. So it's hard to say exactly how the U.S. will respond. It's also hard to say exactly how China will deploy this new capability. But it does seem to represent one more potential source of conflict with China over cyberspace. That's it for our video newsletter for April 2015. For more stories and details, please see the written newsletter. Also in this month's newsletter is another in our series of blogs entitled, Is It Time to Abandon China?, which focuses on increases in risk, or at least perceived increases in risk, in China. We focus on 4 specific areas: the overall economy, China's competitiveness, particularly as relates to being an exporter, legal risk for foreign companies in China, and political risk in light of the political clampdown. So give that a look. This is Dan Joseph for the China Learning Curve. Thanks for watching.